Namaskar to all of you. Thank you for the beautiful songs. This is a series on Sri Aurobindo's book, Synthesis of Yoga. And in the past few talks, we began the section on the exploration of Jnana Yoga. Jnana Yoga, it's again a very common term that we hear, exploration of the truth through the faculty of mind and intellect. And we covered the first two chapters in this section. The first chapter was on the object of knowledge, and the second was on the status of knowledge. Object of knowledge meaning what is it that we are discovering through Jnana Yoga? What is the goal of Jnana Yoga? And here the key essence or message of the chapter was that the key goal or the object of knowledge is the tapas shakti or the deep dynamic will seated in the depths of our being. This deep dynamic will seated in the depths of our being is the real leader of our human system. It is the actual leader of our life. Even though the intellect or the mind in human beings seems like is the leader of our system, but actually it is just a scout of this actual deep dynamic will, which is the one which illuminates the buddhi with the truth, it illuminates the heart with the love, and it illuminates the vital with the energy and the power to do what we are meant to do. So when we seek on the path of Jnana Yoga, then once we seek this deep dynamic will, not only we arrive at that deep force which allows us to be in action on the path of yoga, but also this deep dynamic will is the gateway towards the supreme absolute divine which is beyond this universe, which is commonly thought of as the object of knowledge in Jnana Yoga. But here, by this seeking of deep dynamic will, Jnana Yoga doesn't just remain a static process of merging into silence, but becomes a dynamic process. So this was the key essence of the first chapter of Jnana Yoga, Object of Knowledge. The next chapter was about the steps of discovery of this deep dynamic will. We can talk about it. It is the tapas shakti, it is the divine mother, it is the faith will within us. But how does one discover through Jnana Yoga this divine shakti? And here the first step on Jnana Yoga is the right thought. And the second step is to back this right thought with a true vision or the opening up of the inner vision. When we say right thought, let's say for example, very often we hear, I'm not just this body, I'm something beyond this body, I'm this soul. It is in a way a right thought, but if it is not backed by a vision of being a soul, being an infinite spirit, and it is just left at a thought level, then it becomes dry. So the next step is opening up to that inner vision of what does it mean that I am not just this body, but I am this soul or this deep being which is infinite. And then it has to be followed up with an integral experience of the Jyotirmaya Brahman, which is the expression of divine as a sun. And each, whether it's our mind or this nature are like the rays of this Jyotirmay Brahman or sun. So gathering oneself into an experience of this Jyotirmay Brahman is the third step. And this experience of Jyotirmay Brahman, or seeing that sun in the mind, doesn't just have to be an experience of the mind, it has to turn into an integral experience where we experience this sun not just in the mind, but it enters into our heart as unconditional love. It enters into the aesthetic being as an experience of divine beauty in us and everywhere around us, into our vital as a warm power which is self-assertive, which has that firmness yet that softness and warmth. And when that integral experience happens, then the presence of that deep dynamic will becomes palpable into our whole being. So these are the 3 steps which was the key message of the second chapter, which is called as the status of knowledge, or it could be seen as a ladder of ascension, or getting deeper and deeper into the understanding of this deep dynamic will. And that brings us to the third chapter of the Jnana Yoga section, which is called as the Purified Understanding. So this chapter is about purification. If we look at any process of yoga or anything in our daily life which we wish to do with excellence, there are generally 4 steps to it. The first step is Shuddhi, the second step is Mukti, the third step is Siddhi, and fourth is Bhukti. Shuddhi meaning purification, Mukti meaning liberation, Siddhi meaning perfection, and Bhukti meaning the delight. We can look at it with a very simple example or analogy of our day-to-day life of making a sabzi. To make a sabzi, you first need to wash the vegetables, you need to purify it, you need to cut and chop it. And then you put it on the stove, you heat it under fire, where each of the elements of sabji, they lose their individuality and they are liberated into their oneness. And then as you add the spice and just the right amount of salt to it, there is perfection which gets added to it. And then of course there is the delight of eating that sabzi. So if we look at it, anything that happens in our life, we can look at it in terms of this purification, liberation, and perfection, and the delight of consuming it. And Sri Aurobindo describes these 4 steps and summarizes them in 2 steps, and he calls it seasons of preparation and illumination. In path of yoga, we go through phases where we are being washed and cut and chopped as the periods of preparation, which are followed by that illumination after that. And then again, we go through the process of preparation and then again illumination. And he uses the word seasons to describe the cyclical nature of this process. And sometimes these seasons can be long, because a person may wonder, I've been sitting in meditation, dhyan nahi lag raha hai, I've been reading these texts for so long and I cannot make sense out of them. But it's important to acknowledge that these are like seasons. There will be seasons of preparation, and then there are beautiful periods of illumination for an individual. And one needs to go through them, and one needs to go through in that phase of preparation through purification, which is essential and foundational. A sabzi which is made without washing the vegetables can taste very good, but it can still land us in a hospital. So, the same way in yoga, one can go through spiritual experiences which seem quite mesmerizing, but if they don't carry that foundation of purification, then one can again land up in a hospital. One can end up in imbalances in the body, which sometimes trigger disasters for people, psychiatric disorders, a lot of different things. So it's essential to reflect upon what is the meaning of purification, and even more so when it is a process of Jnana Yoga, where mind is the primary faculty that we are using to discover the truth of life. Mind is also so full of illusions, because if one is practicing, for example, Hatha Yoga or Bhakti Yoga, in Hatha Yoga, there is not so much to lose. You're doing asanas which can be mechanical at times, which will bring in certain good to you. But in Jnana Yoga, when we are dealing with the mental faculty, there are lots of illusions on the way. So this purification becomes essential. And when we talk about the purification of the human system and the purification of this mind, the second thing that we need to acknowledge is that the human system is a system of interdependence. We have a body, we have a pranic force running in us, we have a heart full of emotions, we have our senses, we have our mind, we have our buddhi. All these faculties, they have their certain degree of individuality, and they are all interdependent on each other. Just like we are, as human beings, interdependent upon each other, we are interdependent upon the nature. The same way, each of these faculties are interdependent upon each other. So it would be inappropriate to talk about purification of one without the other. So the purification as a process is a process of purifying each of these faculties together. But out of these, a purified understanding is one of that faculty which holds prime importance, because it becomes the source of light and knowledge which has the capacity to purify the whole being. And this Sri Aurobindo expresses through the words that it is the purified understanding that in man is the most potent cleanser of his turbid and disordered being, and most sovereignly imposes their right working on his other members. So it is the most potent cleanser, and it has the capacity to impose itself upon his members. Knowledge, says the Gita, is the sovereign purity. Light is the source of all clearness and harmony, even as the darkness of ignorance is the cause of all our stumblings. So light and knowledge is that sovereign purity which can cleanse, and the purified understanding is the source through which that light can enter our being. Now the next question in front of us is that what do we mean when we refer to purified understanding? What do we mean when we say buddhi as the prime tool towards purified understanding? So the meaning of buddhi is, it is a true reasoning capacity within all of us as human beings, which has the capacity to look at things taking a back seat from a space of witnessing and disinterested in what is happening, to look at it from an unbiased space in a neutral fashion, from where it can compare and contrast, from where it can discriminate and discern, and arrive at an honest evaluation and judgment of things, without getting influenced by the sensory aversions and attractions, without getting influenced by the desires in the system, without getting influenced by our habitual nature. If we look at it with an example, how this buddhi serves this purpose, even if we take an example of coming on a Sunday to a Sunday satsang, or for that matter, coming to any satsang, how this buddhi is influenced by various different lower forces in us. For starters, pretty much the sensory aversion of sitting down at one place and listening without any stimulation creates a bias in our mind, which takes us away from the decision to come to a satsang. And then the same thing, on a Sunday, a lot of those desires within us, whether we want to go shopping, we want to celebrate, we want to go somewhere, a lot of those desires get magnified in our head, and again, this thing takes a back seat. And then it is the habitual nature of our being which may say that it's not a habit to go to such places. There is a certain inertia and laziness of the Sunday, which again takes us away from the fruitful discernment, the true discernment. If we look at now from the perspective of that pure buddhi, which can discern, which can take a look at the whole thing from a disinterested space, unbiased by this, we all understand how enriching, how deeply enriching, how uplifting it is to come to a satsang. It's not just Sri Aurobindo ashram, but going to any satsang, how deeply enriching and uplifting, and how important it is for our daily life to do this. But very often, because of these lower movements which influence the action of the pure buddhi, we cannot see this clearly. And even while we sit down here, these lower movements influence our capacity to absorb the satsang, and also it influences what we perceive from the satsang. So this is how important it is to purify this buddhi from a state of an animal-like buddhi. In animals, they are pretty much running on these three things. They are running on their desires, their habits, and sensory data. Human beings have been given an intellect, but when it is still influenced by these animalistic lower movements, then it is still at the stage of an animal buddhi. So this is what the intention here is, to purify this buddhi to a stage where it can discern and arrive at an honest judgment without being influenced by these things. Another very important function of this pure buddhi is putting things in perspective. Now, this is another thing which we very often forget, how these lower movements in us magnify some things and minimize the importance of other things. There's some things which are not so important and get magnified in our life, and some things which are so important but given a very small space. And that is actually the first purpose of buddhi, to put things in perspective, to give things their actual place in the whole. Again, to look at it with an example of being a dermatologist, a lot of teenagers come to us with pimples. And how these little pimples get magnified in their psyche for them, making them seek desperate quick fixes. And then if they go on to internet, which is constantly selling stuff and is trying to further magnify their certain needs, then it takes up another level of magnification. Whereas again, with that honest, pure buddhi, if we discern, these pimples are more often than not a temporary transient phenomena in teenage, and they come and they pass. And even if they are happening in excess, rather than seeking for desperate answers, they are truly a reflection of what is going on inside the health of that individual. So putting things in perspective and seeing that this is actually a reflection of the health, and the energy and the will has to be focused on understanding what is going on inside, is of the first importance, and taking care of it there is of the first importance, needs to come in. However, when it is magnified, the teenager is actually spending a lot more time in the night looking on internet for desperate solutions, eating all kinds of food, and hoping that that special skincare regimen is going to resolve my issues. So this is how not being able to put things in perspective at the first place. The child wants to sort himself out. The child wants to help himself or herself. But just because they are not able to put things in perspective, where do I need to focus my energy? What is the place of this pimple in my life? They are being taken on a different trip altogether. And that happens to us on yoga as well. One may wonder, do I want to practice Raj Yoga? Do I want to practice Bhakti Yoga? This yoga is better than that yoga. But if we have a pure buddhi, we can put things in perspective. It does not matter what form of yoga you practice. What matters is the sincerity. What matters is our intention in that process. How we do it is more important than which one do we choose. So this brings us to a very clear understanding that purification and buddhi is a very important aspect on our journey, and purification of this buddhi plays a very important role. And this process of purification also goes through our life, or yoga goes through that process of preparation and illumination, and these cycles will continue to happen. And we understand that each part of our system is interdependent on the other, but purification of understanding is one of the primary needs of the system. Now, if we look at it more deeply, since we talked about that each of these faculties are interdependent on each other, we need to understand that how the impurities in each of these faculties are impacting our purified understanding. And for that, first let's look at the meaning of the word impurity. What do we refer to when we say that the system is not pure, there is impurity in it? So Sri Aurobindo defines it by saying that anything for which there is a departure from its natural dharma is an impurity. Every faculty, just like we have our own dharma and a departure from dharma, each of these faculties also has its own natural tendency and dharma. And let's look at the dharma of each of these faculties and how they relate to impurities. So, one of the key impurities is desire. And desire is an impurity in the will, in the vital and our emotional being. The dharma of the vital is the will to enjoy things, enjoy life. Our prana, its natural tendency is to enjoy what is there. Enjoyment, joy of life opens us up. Joy of life, yoga is a long journey. It helps us be in the moment and be patient on the whole journey. But this will to joy, which is the dharma of vital, is not so much a seeking for joy in some future moment, or reaching out for things, or being attached to some past form of pleasure, but it is enjoying the present moment as it is brought forward to us here and now. To enjoy the unfolding of every moment is the dharma of vital, and how beautifully it opens us up. But how often it is true that we find ourselves uncomfortable in the present moment and investing ourselves in some future goal or in some future pleasure which is going to bring joy in my life. And sometimes we so heavily invest ourselves into that future moment, and then finally when that moment arrives, we find ourselves that we are still equally uncomfortable, only to think that another thing is going to bring that joy and happiness, and it goes on endlessly, and life is lived in a kind of waiting. The same thing can even happen on the path of yoga, where one may feel that, oh, I'm waiting for that moment when I'll be enlightened, and until then I'm waiting for that joy and ananda, rather than feeling the presence of divine, feeling the best possible presence of divine within us in the present moment. So this dharma of vital can become adharmic, whether it is on a spiritual journey or our day-to-day life, or it can become dharmic in our day-to-day life also, and of course it has to become dharmic in our spiritual journey. And now let's look at how these two different states of vital being have an impact on the buddhi. If we look at an individual who is invested in future and who is fully invested in that moment which in future is going to bring joy to him, or he's attached to some past moment and trying to recreate that in his future, and see what impact it has on him. So one is this kind of a vital person, and then there is another person who is there in the present moment, fully open, enjoying every moment as it comes. And both these people are interrupted by another person for help. How would the lens of buddhi of these two individuals interpret the situation? The first person who is busy, who is invested fully, who might be trying very hard, or maybe even on a spiritual journey, who is sitting and meditating, he is in his deep silence, and he will say, please don't, I'm busy, please don't interrupt me. Whereas a person who is in the present moment, enjoying, open, he is willing to help, he is willing to serve, he is willing to receive and share. And he will have a very different lens of buddhi through which he will look at the same situation. So this is the impact. The buddhi is the same, the person is the same, but the state of the vital being has that kind of an impact on our buddhi. Moving to the next, the desire is seated one in the vital, but it is also seated in our heart. the natural dharma of the heart is to love, the will to love. But this will to love is a calm and deep love, a love with intensity. It's beautiful how Sri Aurobindo summarizes things in a few words. The dharma of heart is to love with depth, calmness, and intensity. If it turns adharmic, if it becomes into a restlessness of the heart, which goes superficial, develops attachments, expectations, then fear of losing those attachments, jealousy, wrath, anger, then it becomes adharmic. And when it becomes calm, it goes deeper. As it goes deeper, as it integrates and gains intensity, it has the possibility of becoming more and more self-giving, which is the will of love, to give, a self-giving. And then it may even have a possibility of joining with the universal divine love, the unconditional divine love. But whether or not that happens, even still, it is the depth of love. It's not about in what degree our love is, but the dharma here is to love deeper and deeper every day, go more and more intense in our love every day. That is the dharma of the heart. And again, one can compare and contrast how our buddhi will function if there is the adharma of the heart where it's restless and superficial and attached, versus it is deep and calm and intense. It will have a very different effect on our nervous system, how balanced we are, how balanced our buddhi and our decision making is. So this is the purity and impurity of the heart. The next faculty which influences the buddhi is the senses. And if we look at the senses, they are constantly creating habitual, repetitive motions which are constantly interfering with our thought mind. The sense mind, if we look at ourselves or if we look at other individuals, especially when we are sitting alone with ourselves, we can observe that all of us have a certain thought patterns which we constantly return back to. Especially when we are alone, we have certain common ruminations, a certain common mind chatter we all go back to. And this mind chatter may be constantly getting reinforced by newer data. We are every day being added upon with newer and newer sensory data, but we go back to the same patterns, same thought patterns. And with these similar sense mind thought patterns, it tries to interfere and control our thought mind and our buddhi. So this is somewhere the adharma of the senses. The actual dharma of the senses is to be receptive. They're meant to be receptive to what is happening outside, and also being calm and receptive to what is happening inside us, and not interfere and control. And then the senses have the capacity to expand with calmness and experience the divine beauty and delight in everyone and everything. But first and foremost, they have the capacity to be calm and receptive and leave the function of thought mind to the thought mind and the intellect and not interfere. And when that happens, then naturally it can happen through the buddhi gaining its self-control and concentration and separating itself from the sense mind. And to a degree, it happens by calming down the senses and holding them in a space of receptivity. So we talked about the vital, the heart, and the senses. Let's talk about the dharma of the buddhi. Now, the natural dharma of buddhi is the will to know. It is meant for that purpose, to know things, to discover the truth. But here the adharma enters in terms of a desire to know. So again, just like vital, it becomes into a reaching out. I want to understand this thing, I want to understand that thing, I want to know what is happening there. Curiosity is a natural function of the vital. A child is vital, and whatever is there in front of the child is curious about it. But when it comes to buddhi, it needs to look at things with a certain disinterestedness. If it is going on accumulating more and more knowledge, then it gets attached to the knowledge and averse to a certain idea. This is my knowledge, this is that person's knowledge, this is my point of view, this is that person's point of view. Whereas it has the capacity to look at things with a certain disinterestedness, with a certain equality, a certain madhyata, neither to leftist nor to rightist, being equal in one's mind. And this is not a state of indifference, that I don't care what is happening. Indifference is a more of a closed space. This is an open space where one is in a state of equality. And this brings us to a very important point, that intellect is really powerful. Buddhi is really powerful. And if at the center of intellect, if the intellect is centered around I or my or desire or control, then intellect can be a very powerful tool of justification. The Hitlers and the Ravan, these were people with very powerful intellects. And they could justify to themselves and to others, not just to themselves, but so many other people, what they're doing is right. So if I is at the center, or desire is at the center of the intellect, then it can justify absolutely anything. It is only when there is equality and oneness at the center of the intellect can it actually become a medium for reflection of the truth. So this oneness and equality is essential for the intellect. If we are biased in our opinions, there is no oneness and equality. Then it is pretty much a tool of justification. And this Sri Aurobindo describes the function of intellect as the purified understanding as it is will not lend itself to any desire or craving. So will not lend itself either to any predilection or distaste from any idea or truth, and will refuse. So it is one, it will not have any desire or craving. The second, it will not lend itself to any predilection to an idea or a distaste for an idea, and will refuse to be attached even to those ideas of which it is most certain, or to lay on them such an undue stress as is likely to disturb the balance of truth. So there are some things which we feel absolutely certain about. For that matter, what you read, not just our own things, but sometimes the literature which we read every day, We can feel almost absolutely certain about that, but even not to lay undue stress on that, to disturb the balance of truth and depreciate the values of other elements of a complete and perfect knowledge. So what we are seeking is not just a true knowledge, we are seeking a complete and perfect knowledge. And that complete and perfect knowledge includes what we feel certain about, and it also includes what the other person may feel certain about. As Mahatma Gandhi said, that truth is like a tree with multiple branches to it, and all of us have our own version of truth. So complete and perfect truth is ready to include in it all these things which we feel absolutely are right and we feel are absolutely wrong from our own point of view. So that once it starts to happen, it takes us, when all these things start to happen, it takes us towards what we call as the pure buddhi from an animalistic buddhi. Now this whole process might seem quite overwhelming, that this vital purification, this heart purification, this sensory, this buddhi, it is all so much, and how can one do? But the fact is that when we turn to the Divine Mother and we feel the presence of the Divine Mother, when we open up to the Divine Mother, when we receive her presence and light in our life, then this whole process naturally happens. The light starts to enter our vital and makes it full with joy. And when it is full with joy, it is not seeking past or future. It is there in the present moment, enjoying things as is. When this light enters the heart, then the heart naturally is full of self-giving. When it enters the buddhi, it clarifies the complexity of our intellect, simplifies things, and brings us to that madhyata. And it does the same with the senses. So eventually the whole process is turning not just ourselves but all these faculties towards the Divine Mother and constantly offering them and reflecting them on the presence of this deep dynamic will, or that tapas shakti. And the importance of understanding these things is largely to build up that vigilance, because as we just said, the intellect can go on justifying what I'm doing is correct. But if we understand these things, there is a greater possibility in our vigilance to be able to identify the presence of these impurities and offer them to the Divine Mother. Awareness is the first step in our healing, and this helps expand our awareness. The other key thing here is understanding our own swadharma in the present moment. If we are acting out of our own swadharma, then naturally the process of purification or the dharmic possibility of these faculties will align to the swadharma. But if we are choosing to do something which is against our swadharma, then no matter we sit down in meditation, it will not be able to purify these things. For example, Arjuna, in that moment in the battlefield, says that I now want to do meditation. It will not at that moment, even though meditation can be very purifying, in that moment will not do justice to his senses, to his vital, his heart. It will leave him in conflict rather than truly purifying him. So the moment we embrace our swadharma, which is what is the best thing I can do, what is the best thing that needs to be done in the present moment for myself, for the context and for the whole, then naturally this process of purification starts to happen. And this takes us forward from our understanding of the animalistic buddhi to the pure buddhi to a third possibility of buddhi, which is the higher buddhi, which Sri Aurobindo describes as the intellectual understanding is only the lower buddhi. There is another and a higher buddhi, which is not intelligence but vision, is not understanding but rather an overstanding, in knowledge and does not seek knowledge and attain it in subjection to the data it observes. So it does not seek knowledge and attain the knowledge by subjecting itself to the data. Normally, how we perceive knowledge is by subjecting ourselves to something. If I want to understand the chair in front of me, I subject myself to the chair. But it already possesses the truth and brings it out in terms of a revelatory and intuitional thought. So this higher buddhi already possesses the truth and reveals the truth. So it's an overstanding, not an understanding. It's revelatory, it already possesses the truth. So this is a higher possibility of buddhi beyond just its purity. It is how we normally relate to our intuition, which normally we are receiving these intuitions from this higher faculty by means of sleep. We wake up with a certain understanding, or through a gut feeling in our body, we are receiving intuition. This is what I need to do. Maybe this will turn out better. So that is how we are normally receiving it. But if we truly want to consciously open up to this higher intellect, then we need to go beyond purification. We need to develop another capacity in the intellect, which is the power of intellectual passivity. When the buddhi starts from animalistic buddhi, where senses are playing a very important role and they have to take charge, the desire has to take charge. And when this animalistic buddhi moves towards pure buddhi, we are talking about the senses need to leave the function of intellect to itself. So the senses have to turn rather from taking charge to turning into a receptacle. And here the same process, when we are talking about movement of the pure buddhi to higher buddhi, now intellect, rather than taking the charge, has to turn into a receptacle. And that is the power of intellectual passivity, the power of the intellect to sit in silence and with the breath and just receive those intuitions. The catch here is that many a times what we perceive as intuitions from the higher intellect are actually lower movements mimicking to be intuitions. And this is something Sri Aurobindo talks about as being vigilant to, and that's why the importance of purification of buddhi. But Sri Aurobindo gives a beautiful two-step remedy to move from pure buddhi to the higher buddhi. The first step, along with the development of intellectual passivity, is to develop the capacity in the intellect to differentiate between what is a true intuition and what is falsehood or lower movements mimicking intuitions. A capacity to differentiate between the two. The second step is to not give too much importance to any conclusions that we draw from any intellectual processing in our life and offer them all to this higher intellect. There are so many things we draw conclusions about in our life. We process things, we process data, and then we arrive at a conclusion, and we hold that strongly. So with purified buddhi, we understand not to hold it too tightly, but here we are talking about offering it to the higher intellect. Offer every conclusions we draw to the higher intellect. And then as we start doing, intuitions start dropping in about things. And as these intuitions drop in, along with the intellectual reasoning, and they mix up together, newer conclusions form. And here again, we don't get attached to those newer conclusions. We again offer it to the higher intellect. Allow more intuitions to drop in, again offer to the higher intellect. In that process, Sri Aurobindo says that gradually the intellect goes on getting transmuted into this higher power. So this is the two-step remedy Sri Aurobindo offers, where we are vigilant of the fact and we learn to differentiate between what is true intuition, what is falsehood, and then not get attached to any conclusion and keep offering everything back to the higher faculty. Otherwise, what happens is we get one intuition and we get excited that I have a beautiful revelation, and then we, with our lower movements, we make our own story around it. But here it's again offering it back, and going from intuition to intuition to intuition to intuition is the way forward. So to summarize the whole talk and look at the insights and actionables for us and see how purification is foundational in our journey, whether it is life or our spiritual journey. Our whole system is interdependent on each other, so it's very important to look at the purification of the whole system. And herein reminds me of another important point. It's not just about our own purification. We are constantly interacting with the world. So eventually it is about the collective purification of the whole, which is important. So acknowledge the interdependence of the faculties within us and our interdependence on the world for purification when we talk about this aspect. The third, we talked about the three possibilities, how we define buddhi, the main capacities of buddhi to be able to reason unbiased and also to be able to put things in perspective. Then we looked at how this animal buddhi is built up on the adharmic impurities of the vital, the heart, the senses, the mind, and how it can be taken towards their pure and dharmic aspect, leading us towards eventually centering the buddhi around oneness and equality. Eventually, all these purification creates oneness and equality at the center of the buddhi rather than I, me and desire, which allows the buddhi to reflect the truth. And then we looked at the possibility of this pure buddhi transmuting into a higher buddhi. The key actionable for us here is to question ourselves. How is my vital driven? How is my heart driven? What kind of love, what kind of joy do I seek? Do I feel complete and comfortable in the present moment? Or do I feel incomplete and seeking something in future or past? Are my senses or the mind chatter going on in the head influencing the intellect? Am I trusting with my buddhi that whatever knowledge is needed will come? Or am I seeking knowledge from outside all the time? So these are some questions we can ask ourselves and then offer them to the Divine Mother and initiate our process towards purification. Thank you. Om Tat Savitur Varam Rupam Jyotihi parasya dhimahi yannah satyena deepayet. Yannah satyena deepayet. Om tatsavitur varam rupam Jyotihi parasya dhimahi yannah satyena deepayet. Yannah satyena deepayet. Om tatsavitur varam rupam Jyotihi parasya dhimahi yannah satyena deepayet. Yannah satyena deepayet. Thank you. Dr. Bijlani, would you like to add something?
I have a small question.
Yeah.
Second point after Shuddhi is Mukti.
Mukti.
Mukti we'll discuss later.
Yes, Mukti, the liberation is here the liberation from attachments to anything. Even before we talk about Siddhi or perfection to enter, we need to expand to be liberated or being attached to things. So, liberation is a kind of a complete detachment. So, it will come later and it is a part of every chapter. Yeah.
But the way we discussed Shuddhi today, if someone is successful enough, then it will incorporate the next stage. That
Next stage.
Mukti.
Mukti, absolutely.
What is your observation on that?
I think one of the things is that neither of these are linear in nature, that Shuddhi is followed by Mukti is followed by, they are all happening simultaneously. In initial stage for the sadhak, Shuddhi is the main focus and liberation is lesser and Siddhi and Bhukti is lesser. As it goes on, it's more liberation, more and more of this Siddhi and the Bhukti. The sadhak is in a pure state of the divine experience everywhere, every moment, and feels more liberated. The need for Shuddhi is very little. So actually, we do express, and thank you for bringing it up, we do express these things as linear, but they are happening simultaneously. That's true. Thank you.